So welcome everyone to the New Haven Museum. I'm Margaret Ann Tarkaszewski, the director, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight for this special presentation. And we're so grateful to our speaker, Connecticut author Jill Marie Snyder, for her book, Dear Mary, Dear Luther, A Courtship in Letters, and her willingness to share her parents' story and her own personal journey in researching her family's history with our audience. Dear Mary, Dear Luther, published in 2017, received the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society Award for Nonfiction Romance History Focus in 2019. The museum also would like to thank Charles Warner Jr., president of the Connecticut Freedom Trail, for introducing us to Jill and her work, which is a significant contribution to our understanding of local history and the African-American experience here in New Haven. Please send us your questions using the chat feature. Everyone will be mute during the presentation. And I'd also like to thank our Education Director, Khalil Kotap, for coordinating tonight's program, and to all of you out there who have helped us promote this program. Jill has agreed to return at the end of March for our workshop, and we'll be happy to announce that date soon. So a little bit about tonight's speaker. Retired from a corporate career, Jill Marie Snyder has a BA in Urban Studies from the University of Connecticut and an MA in Communication from Fairfield University. In addition, she has completed Boston University's Principles of Genealogy course. Since its founding in 2006, Jill has served on the board of the Community Healing Network Incorporated, supporting its mission to mobilize Black people across the African diaspora to heal from the trauma caused by centuries of anti-Black racism, free ourselves of deadly stereotypes, and reclaim our dignity and humanity as people of African descent. Snyder is currently researching prominent African Americans living in New Haven, Connecticut in the 1800s. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you, Margaret Ann. Thank you for having me. And hello, everybody. I know I have some friends and family on the line, so I'm really excited about sharing with you. So I gave some thought because I have been sharing a lot about my book, and I gave some thought for this audience, the best way to frame the presentation. And I recalled an incident many years ago. I went to a presentation about the history of New Haven. And when the speaker got to the 1940s, he said there were no Black people in New Haven until the 1940s, when many came from the South to find work. And frankly, it pained me to hear the stories of thousands of people boiled down to one sentence. And I knew that when my parents came to New Haven, there was a community here with churches, businesses, social organizations. And I just was disappointed. So while it was true that many African Americans came here in the 1940s to work at Winchester's, Repeating Arms, and other factories, I believe they were in search of more than work. I think the search was broader than that. It was a search for opportunity that had been denied through the decades. And each person and each family had a unique story. So I want to share with you my family's unique story. So I'm going to go through some family history, read a few excerpts from a few of my parents' love letters that are in the book, talk about New Haven's history, particularly New Haven Black history, and then at the end, I'll share some pictures from our family album. So this is my mother, Mary Estelle Brooks Snyder. She was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the same hometown as our President Biden. Later, when she was a teenager, the family moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and that's where she met my father. She was the oldest child of Clarence Augustus Brooks II and Stella May Paul Brooks. And she had two sisters, Sarah Jane and Lillian Irene, who we all called Aunt Sissy. I think I was a teenager before I knew her real name. And my uncle, Clarence Augustus Brooks. So these are Mary's parents. Her mother was Stella May Paul Brooks. She was of German and Welsh ancestry. And in the early 1900s, her family moved next door to my family in Catawissa, Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a lot older than Stella. When she was still a child, he went off working as a traveling musician. And when he returned, later became a barber. And they eloped in 1917. They were married by a judge. Stella's family was not happy with her marrying an African American man, even though the two families had been friends for many years. Especially her father and her brothers never spoke to her again. And it led to some ugly incidents later on in their lives. So, this is my mother's grandparents, Clarence Augustus Brooks the First, and they repeated names a lot back in the early 1900s. He was from Baltimore. We believe that he was married before he married my great grandmother Mary, and because he often went back to Baltimore to visit his children. So Mary is the daughter of Henry Jones, who escaped Virginia enslavement. And I want to read. I'm going to read a little bit from my book and read to you his obituary, Henry's obituary, published in 1882, because it tells a fascinating story of his life. It says, Mr. Henry Jones, colored, who lives near this town and who is widely known throughout this section of the country, died at his residence Tuesday afternoon last of pleural pneumonia after an illness of 5 days. The life of the deceased was an eventful one, and would, if published, rival in interest the famed Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was born in slavery near Winchester, Virginia, in about 1807. After remaining a slave for about 20 years, he made his escape, aided by his master, after a long and perilous journey through the mountains and swamps of Virginia and Maryland. Traveling by night and hiding through the day, he reached McKinney's Ironworks near Williamsport, where he remained for some time and then went to New York State, where he was married, and thence to Maineville. About 35 years ago, he came to this place where he remained up to the time of his death. He was the father of 7 children, 6 of whom are still living, 3 sons and 3 daughters. His wife died in 1860 in this place. Old Henry, as he was familiarly called, was a favorite of everyone, and his death is universally regretted. Now, many people, when they hear that, often ask me, what does it mean that his escape was aided by his master? I don't know. I have some theories about that, which I'm not going to share, but it is a fascinating detail that I'd love to really understand. So, Stella's family, I do not have any photos of her parents, and I've skulked around in my Paul Cousins ancestry websites to see if I could find pictures, and I have not. I do know that Charles Paul descended from Revolutionary War Hessian soldiers, so his family was here back in the 1700s. And Mary Davis Paul is both also German ancestry, but also of Welsh ancestry. So the pictures on the right are of Stella's grandparents, and William is where the Welsh comes from. And Amelia Dietz Davis was the mother of 16, I believe, and the Dietz women were prolific, and it seems like every generation had 16 or 18 children. And so I'm related to hundreds and hundreds of Dietz descendants. Now, this is my dad's side of the family. His mother was Maud. She was unwed when he was born, so I don't have his father's ancestry. She had one sister, Delphine, and I'm mentioning her on purpose because she plays a role in my parents' romance. And she had 7 brothers who were my father's father figures, and they always made sure that Maud and my father were well taken care of and had everything they could want, and my father adored all of his uncles. On his side of the family, on the Snyder side, their his grandparents were Simon Snyder II and Charlotte Britton. And I found in my research that Simon was a chef, a very well-known chef in Wilkes-Barre in the early 1900s. And a fascinating detail in his obituary was that he spoke fluent Italian and German. Simon's parents were Simon Snyder I. Again, they repeat names a lot. And Julia Smith Snyder. And the Charlotte's parents were Daniel and Mary Britton. And the interesting detail about them is they actually were neighbors. So Simon and Charlotte grew up pretty much next door. They lived in a small town that today is called Pottsville, Pennsylvania, but when they lived there, it was called Deep Creek Valley, and then it changed its name a few times in between, and today it's known as Pottsville, Pennsylvania. There was an enclave of Black families there that intermarried through the generations. So women in the Snyder family, there's a couple of marriages into a family called the Enty family, E-N-T-Y, and I'm told by Enty cousins I've connected with that there are hundreds of Entys living throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio. So now to the letters. My parents met when they were paired in a wedding procession in 1935, and my father was about 7.5 years older than my mother, so she was only maybe 15 or 16 at this point. And I guess Luther was smitten and found out that Mary lived next door to his Aunt Delphine. And so, as the story is told, he would visit his aunt, who before meeting my mother rarely made trips to visit his aunt. He would visit her and then spend hours on the Brooks front porch swing with Mary and her sister Sarah. And this went on for about a year, I'm told, before Luther made it clear he was interested in Mary. The sisters weren't sure who he was coming to visit. But one day, Sarah was working and she wasn't there when Luther came, and Luther made it clear at that point it was Mary. So the letters begin in 1937. Mary's about to graduate from high school, and Luther decides to leave Wilkes-Barre in search of work at Asbury Park, New Jersey, a summer resort, very popular back in the day. So the letters, the first couple of letters, they're just very polite. How are you? Blah, blah, blah. But then in this June 4th letter, I'm going to read some excerpts from. My father is very effusive, and I think about it from his perspective. He grew up in Wilkes-Barre, didn't have a chance to travel. And so this is his first time at a beach resort, first time seeing the ocean, and he's just loving it. So he writes, "Dear Mary, it was really swell to receive a letter from you. I only read it 17 times since I received it. I don't start working steady until about the 12th. So until then, I am vacationing. Every day, I put my dark glasses on and stroll up and down the boardwalk. Everyone wears dark glasses. Therefore, everyone looks alike, white and colored. It's lots of fun watching the waves roll in and out from the shore. I sit and watch the liners pass at night, and in the daytime, it's very picturesque. You can buy anything you want on the boardwalk. So big shots come down here to buy their fashions. You should see the darn fool fandangles they wear, such as hats with no tops and just the sole of the shoe. But that is the style." He's really loving it. So at the end of the summer, instead of going back to Wilkes-Barre, he decides to go to New York. And he moves to Harlem, and he immediately starts having a ball. He's a bachelor. He's got a job working in a hotel, and he's just dazzled by New York City. And a lot of the letters I include, the material you see in the box at the top, I call them illuminations, because they mention many things in the letters. They mention like this letter, they mention entertainers, they mention sporting events, the news of the day. And so you'll find, or as you read, hopefully you'll read, what people tell me is that these notes help to transform people back in time. So on the September 14th, he writes, "All New York is swing crazy. I saw and heard Ella Fitzgerald. She is very clever. I went to the Apollo and saw Wesley Bunch in Don Redman's Big Apple Review last week. Then to the famous Savoy Ballroom, and the Harvest Moon Lindy Hoppers are there. You should see the cutting up they do. As for myself, I'm sort of sentimentalist, you know. Listen to So Rare. It's my favorite, and so are you, Luke." So he's being kind of cute. I think he's learning to be a playboy myself. so, um, so in 1938, uh, about 7 or 8 months later in the spring, Mary finally visits New York with her sister Sarah, and it's all very wholesome. They stay with my father's cousin, who had lived in an apartment building in Harlem. And during the visit, though, reality kind of sets in. So she writes a letter to him thanking him for a wonderful time, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the letter, she writes, "After all the nice girls in New York, Luther, I really felt I should begin to worry where I come into the picture. I wish you had have gone to a smaller town. Maybe I could have rested a little easier. I have to admit, but I'm afraid I'm jealous, Mary." So he writes back. He's a little bit coy. He says, "I admit there are several nice girls I've met since I've been here, but who said you weren't nice? There's always a nicest one, and that is YOU." So I think this is a bit of a turning point in their relationship. Mary's got a clearer idea of where she stands. She doesn't, she just accepts his emotional state. And so they just continue writing these nice little letters, what I did, where I went, uh, and and they kind of continue like that. And then in this 1939 letter on New Year's Day, I think my dad's a little bit tipsy, and he lets out a little bit more about how he feels. He says, "Dear Mary, Happy New Year, baby. It's now 9 a.m., New Year's Day, and I just come in from one of those wild New Year's nights. And the first and only one I can think about is you. And before I retire, I must express myself." So you see his scrawl on the right side, and he ends up writing like that 7 pages. And he goes back and forth between what he's been doing, and they'll have a little outburst of how he feels about my mother. And he says, "Every day is a holiday since I met you." And then a little few lines later, "Without a doubt, Mary, you are really sweet." And few lines even further, "Yes, indeed, Mary, you really do things to me." So this is one of my favorite letters. It's so much fun. It's so much fun to read. So the letters continue. They become more emotional, more revealing. The family goes through some difficult times, illnesses, deaths. Of course, the economic situation is challenging, and there's a war going on in Europe. But finally, in a letter in September 1940, my father broaches the subject of marriage, but it's kind of stilted. He talks about, you should come and you can stay with my cousin and find a job, and, we'll get married. And my mother isn't quite buying it. So a few months later, in November, he tries it again, and he really pours out his heart. He says, "Dear Mary, if it were possible to love you any more, I would. But there isn't a bit of stray love to be found for you. At one time, I scoffed at the word love and the idea of marriage. Then at the first sight of you, I began to feel somewhat of a change in my outlook of life. Only I was a little timid admitting it. And now I can't conceive anything but planning my life for you and with you. Since meeting you, I have derived so much pleasure at the sight of you, in your walk, in your talk, in your dress, the thrill of holding your hand, and your caresses. I tingle at the mention of you. So he never really says, Mary, will you marry me? They just kind of glide into discussing when they'll get married and when Mary's going to arrive in New York to get married. And they uh, um, get married on my father's 30th birthday, January 30, 1941. There were no family members present, just a couple of people that were my father's friends as witnesses, and no wedding pictures were taken. And through a distant relative of my mother who lived in New Haven, they learned that factory jobs were available. And so they packed up what they had and they moved to New Haven in June 1941. And my father was hired at Winchester Repeating Arms. So now I want to switch a little bit and talk about Black New Haven. And I love this postcard from the museum's collection that shows what downtown New Haven looked like in the 1940s. Um, but New Haven in the 40s was a boom town because of World War II. A lot of factories that hadn't made any items related to the military re-geared to support the war effort. So in addition to the arms manufacturers working hard to keep up with demands for military weapons, there were, for example, corset makers began making harnesses for pilots, and New Haven Clock Company converted to manufacturing timing devices. So there were tons and tons of jobs for people available. So at the same time my parents arrived from New York, of course, there were a lot of African Americans from the South also streaming into New Haven for factory jobs. But housing was difficult to find due to housing discrimination. I'll review later that Black people were kind of limited to certain sections of New Haven where they were permitted to live or invited to live, however you want to put it. So my grandmother, Stella, came to New Haven and rented an apartment. And then my mother's entire family came here, Sarah, Clarence, and my Aunt Sissy. And my father found work at Repeating Arms, and everybody was able to find work. So I want to take a look back on New Haven history. And I found a report that had the names of slave owners in New Haven in 1790. So there were enslaved people in New Haven and free people of color in New Haven, going back that far, and probably even further back than that. Um, and you can see from the names of the slave owners, you see familiar names of schools, streets. I actually lived on Mansfield Street at one time. Woodward Avenue, we know, and going down, you see Hill House, which of course a lot of people have graduated from that school. So there were, and this was just a partial list. There's quite a long list, and there's a citation at the bottom of the slide where you can find a report of all the slave owners in Connecticut in 1790. And the woman at the bottom, Elizabeth Tritton, is not a well-known name, but I'm going to explain a little bit why I included her in the presentation, because she is, in a way, significant. So there's a great book called New Haven Negroes, A Social History by Robert Austin Warner, and it was originally published by the Yale University Press in 1940. And it's difficult to find, but I was able to obtain a copy on a secondhand copy. And it's a fascinating book. And Warner writes about New Haven in the 17 and 1800s that New Haven had money, and blacks, whether slave or servants, were the accompaniment of wealth and aristocracy. The Negroes, like money, were a result of commerce. Some were acquired as part of a trade in the West Indies. Others were brought home by Connecticut shipmasters who trafficked in ivory. So he explains why there were both free and enslaved people in New Haven, and the So there was trade directly from New Haven to the West Indies. Manufactured goods from Connecticut were sent to the West Indies, and then the captains would return with rum and sugar and other items from the West Indies, and as he writes, Africans, enslaved Africans. There was an exhibit 3 or 4 years ago in, I think, Old Saybrook about the ivory trade in Connecticut, and explaining why we have a town called Ivoryton. The way it was explained, if I recall correctly, that shipmasters would go to Africa, they would enslave a gang of men who would help them go out and kill elephants and harvest the the trunks for ivory. Then those same men would be brought on ships with the ivory to Connecticut and sold into slavery here in Connecticut. And of course, the ivory would be sold, and it was as I said, a big business in the river towns along in Connecticut. So again, back to New Haven Negroes by Robert Austin Warner. He writes that beginning in the 1800s, New Haven's caste system began to harden, and Black people were limited to living in certain areas, limited to certain jobs. And I think that it was a reaction to the fact that there was actually some prosperity and some people becoming well known in the Black community. And one of the best pieces of evidence of the Black community in New Haven was the formation of 3 Black churches in the 1800s. The AME Church, now on Dixwell Avenue, was formed in 1818 by a group of Black Methodists. Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ, where I'm a member, was formed in 1820. And St. Luke's Episcopal Church, where actually I grew up, was formed by Black members of Trinity Church on the Green in 1844. So, I mean, if I think that's all the evidence you need to know that there was a Black community here well before the 1940s. Now, I said I would loop back on Elizabeth Tritton, who was one of the slaveholders that I showed in an earlier slide. And Elizabeth Tritton owned 2 slaves, Lois Tritton and her daughter Lucy. And she put them up for sale in 1825. And they were purchased by an abolitionist minister who freed them about 6 weeks later. And they were the last slaves sold on the New Haven Green. And Lucy, in 1844, is listed as one of the founding members of St. Luke's. So a little bit there. So I want to go through some people that I hope to write more about more extensively that just fascinate me. And I call them the strivers. So even though there was oppression and it was challenging living in for Black folks living in New Haven, there were some people who didn't let that hold them back. So the first person is Reverend Jacob Osen, and he was a former seaman, which was a popular occupation for free Black men. Working on ships offered them a little more freedom, a little more sense of equality. Sometimes they were the steward for the captain or the cook on the ship. And after that work, he spent many years trying to become an ordained priest. And the goal was to ordain Jacob, and then he would found a Black Episcopal church in New Haven. So finally, he was ordained in 1828, but unfortunately, he contracted cancer and passed away and never actually served as a priest. And I think William Lanson is well known. There was a statue of him erected in September. He was a builder of Long Wharf and Farmington Canal, and he was the king. In communities in Connecticut, people were excluded from the judicial system for things like bad debts and things like that between Black people. So many of the towns had a person that they called the king or the chief, and people would go to that person to help arbitrate and find solutions to these small issues. So he was the man. He was a big shot in New Haven. Another person was Peter Vogelzang, another fascinating person. He's originally from New York, but he lived in New Haven in the 1840s. And he was later, he was a Civil War hero serving with the Massachusetts 54th. And some people say, I haven't been able to validate this myself, but it's written in a lot of places that he was the first African American Army officer. He achieved the rank of lieutenant. And he was portrayed by Morgan Freeman in the movie Glory. And there's a great scene where Morgan Freeman's character, which is Peter Vogelsang, gives a really uplifting speech to the soldiers before the big battle they fought in South Carolina. Another Episcopal priest, James Theodore Hawley, was the third rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, and he actually, before he came to New Haven, had a national reputation in working for the improvement of Black folks in America. He was the rector for a few years, and then he left New Haven in 1861 for Haiti, where he founded the Haitian Episcopal Church, and that's why he's Right Reverend James Theodore Hawley, and he's a big deal in Haiti. Another person with a connection to Haiti, Ebenezer Bassett, and he was appointed ambassador to Haiti in 1869, and he was the first African American ambassador, U.S. ambassador. Reverend Amos Beeman was a pastor of Dixwell, but he was also a national civil rights leader, and he served as the president of the 1843 National Convention of Colored Citizens. William Grimes is someone I just learned about in the last few years. A descendant of his has published a book about his life. He published the first copyrighted slave narrative. There were other slave narratives earlier than his, but he had the foresight to have his copyrighted. And he was one of the members of both the African Ecclesiastical Society, which was a forerunner of Dixwell Congregational Church. And he's also listed as a founder of St. Luke's Church. And the last person is my favorite because it's the only woman on the list. Sarah Boone was a dressmaker, and she's believed to be the first woman of African ancestry to receive a U.S. patent. She invented the first ironing board. It's not like the folding board we have today. It was wooden, and it was she designed it so she could iron the very large dresses that she made for her customers. So okay, so I promised that I would share a few family photos. So this one was taken. I put Easter Sunday, 1942. That's what I'm guessing, because Roy is a baby. He was born on December 2nd, 1941. And my mother recalled at the time when she had Roy that Black women were not placed in rooms in the maternity ward. They were, because of segregation in the hospital, they were forced to sleep on cots in the hospital hallway. And this is me in the middle with my two brothers. Roy is 12 years older than me, and Dale was 10 years older than me. So I was the little sister. They called me Rascal. I'm not sure why I had that nickname. And here's the picture of later. The last picture of the family altogether, my father died of cancer in 1973. And this was taken Christmas 1969. I believe we were at my Aunt Sarah's house. So that's my mother, Dale, my dad, Roy, and me. And I love this picture. Now, I want to prove that we are a real New Haven family. So everybody in my family worked at Yale one time or another. When I first graduated from college, I worked as a research assistant in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health. My brother Roy was a human resources manager, which is why I got the job at Yale. My dad worked for Campus Mail. My brother Dale was a campus policeman for 26 years. And my mother ended up with the most interesting job. Now, my mother didn't work until I was about 16. So I like to say that my mom went from being a homemaker to being a nuclear physicist because she was a research assistant in the Wright Nuclear Structure Laboratory, reporting to Dr. Horace Taft, who was actually a grandson of President Taft. And just to prove she really worked for him, I scanned a note that he wrote. She had many of these notes that she'd saved. He writes, Miss Snyder, Rob, who was the PhD candidate she was actually supporting. He writes, Rob and I are away again today, Monday, this time at MIT. We will be here tomorrow and for the rest of the week, however, H. Taft. And Rob gave my mother a copy of his thesis, which I have, it's just amazing. He wrote a personal inscription in the thesis to her, and there's a printed thank you to her in his thesis. So just, I want to conclude with some reflections. And this paragraph, even though I have it here at the end of the presentation, it's actually the last thing I wrote in the book, but it's in part of the preface. And I had a beta reader read my manuscript before I sent it to be published, and his advice was to put more of my feelings about my parents in the book. And the last section of the book I call Mary and Luke, I write extensively about my parents, but that was because of the advice of the beta reader. And it really forced me to think about them and to think about each of them, their impact on my life. And I evolved to thinking about them much more broadly than just being my mom and dad. I really started to think about them as more holy. And so I wrote this, as I said, it's the last paragraph of the preface. After reading my parents' letters and thinking about their lives, I no longer view Mary and Luther as a child views a parent. Now I see their full humanity, their hopes, their dreams, their disappointments. The converging forces of racism and economics made it impossible for them to fulfill their full potential, so they poured their hopes into their children. For that, I am eternally grateful. I'm so proud and thrilled that my book, as Margaret mentioned in the beginning, won an award, and I just can't imagine what my parents would have to say about this. They would be so surprised that their words won an award. And I want to thank Margaret Ann for all the support I received, and I want to thank Julie and Khalil, who've also been a great help. As Margaret mentioned, I'll be back in March to lead a family history workshop titled Telling Your Family Story. I really feel it's important for everyone to tell their family story, but especially I want to encourage African Americans to tell family stories. And I really feel that one reason I feel it's important is that reverence for ancestors is an important part of African culture. And by focusing on our family stories, learning more about our families, I found a deep sense of joy and gratitude for all that my ancestors did for me. And that's what revering ancestors is about, not revering them because they simply lived and died, but revering them because of what they did in their life to make our lives better. So again, I want to thank you all for joining. Copies of my book are available here at the museum and from online booksellers and bookstores. And Margaret Ann, Khalil, I don't know if there are any questions you'd like me to answer. So I'll turn it back to you.
So hi, I'll be the voiceless, cameraless person just to read the questions to you. First one is, do you know if Luther was left-handed?
Do I know if Luther was left-handed?
Yeah. That was one question.
Okay. He always wrote with his right hand. I don't know.
Okay.
Is there more to that than this?
No, it was. It might have been just the way it looked. Let's see. Can you tell us some of their disappointments? And also, you referenced to some of the ugliness resulting from their marriage. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I guess the first question would be about my parents. Tell them a little bit more about their disappointments. I learned in the letters, my mother made a comment one time in one of the letters that she was wanted to be an artist. And I never knew that before I read the letters. But the amazing thing was after she retired, she took up the hobby of painting. And my home is full of her artwork. And it's, she's untrained. It's very basic, but it's beautiful that after a lifetime of raising children and working, she fulfilled her dream of being an artist. My dad's disappointment, although he never said it outright, I believe his disappointment was that he couldn't go to college. My father had a lot of friends when he was young who played tennis, and families weren't able to send them to college, which his family could not do. And so his mantra for me from as early as I can remember was go to college, go to college, go to college. And I think he was in a way fulfilling that college dream of his through his children. And what was the other question?
Let's see. It was also you referred to some ugliness resulting from their marriage. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So they're referring to my grandparents' marriage, Stella and Clarence. An interracial marriage in 1917 was unusual. They lived for a time in a town called Bloomsburg, which is probably about 10 miles from Catawissa, Pennsylvania. It's the way I explain it is Bloomsburg is in that red part of Pennsylvania that you see on the map on election night. And my grandfather Clarence worked with his brother-in-law. They had a barber shop in Bloomsburg. And they actually, even though it was the Depression, they were doing okay financially, the way my mother described it. But the people in the town and my grandmother always felt it was her brothers were not happy to have this interracial family, a little bit prosperous more than some of the other people that lived in the town. And my mother recalled, it's actually in the book. My mother recalled that their family, sometimes there were people marching in front of their house, and I won't name any particular group, but burning crosses on the lawn. And eventually they burned down the barbershop. And at that point, that's when my family moved to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I think they realized that the next stop would be attacking them personally, and they had to go. And it really destroyed the life of my grandfather's brother-in-law, and his family had a lot of difficulties after that as well.
Okay, we have another question. Versus what your parents faced, what are some forces of racism and economics impacting your ability to realize your dreams or potential, if any?
Certainly, I experienced racism and bigotry my whole life. I mean, I can tell a story. I tell a story, I think it's in the book. The first time I encountered racism, I was about 6 years old, and my little friend, first grade friend, Carolyn, invited me to come to her house to play. So the plan was that I would go to her house and we would play, and my father would pick me up at 5 o'clock. And when we got to her house, her mother opened the door and she took one look at me and yanked Carol in the house and said, "You can't come in here," and slammed the door in my face. So I had to find my way home by myself. When I got home, my mother, of course, asked, "What's wrong? You're supposed to wait to your father." And I started to cry and told her what happened. And she sat me down on the couch and she said to me, "Jill, you're going to meet a lot of people in your life. And there are some people who are going to not like you." You said, "And some of the people that won't like you, it'll be for good reasons. You have different interests, different hobbies. You just don't click. But there are some people who are not going to like you because you're a little colored girl." Now, this was 1958, 59. So racism is a fact of life for every Black person. And every child or has that moment when you realize that being Black is going to make you stand out. It's going to create barriers, and there are people who are not going to like you. So Margaret Ann mentioned in the beginning that I would belong to an organization called the Community Healing Network. And it's our mission to help people heal from the lie of that Black people are inferior in every way in some people's eyes. So it's just a fact of life. Now, in my family, the mantra was you just have to work twice as hard to get half as far as other people. I'll let the people, I don't know what opportunities are missed. I can only guess, I can only speculate. But throughout my life, that from that first incident, I have not escaped uh, moments of bigotry. I guess the most recent one I'll share because it's something that I'm still very angry about. I was driving through Vermont, and it was very heavy traffic, people going home on a Sunday after a weekend in Vermont. So everyone was in the speed limit. Nobody was speeding. That wasn't possible because of the traffic. And a state trooper called me over, and I was terrified. Like, why is the state trooper calling me over with the siren and the whole thing? And I was by myself, a long way from home. And he just came over to me and just asked me one question. He said, "Are you an American?" And I was like, "Yes." And I'm still angry about that because my family's been here since the 1600s. According to Ancestry.com, I'm descended from early Africans that arrived in the 1600s. So my family's been here 400 years. But this person felt they had the right, because I'm brown, to ask me if I'm an American.
Yeah, those are tough stories to share. So thank you for sharing that. So another question we have is: did your parents comment on any of the social life in New Haven when they first moved, or the early years, and any organizations they were part of?
Oh yeah, they enjoyed their early years in New Haven. I know my father was part of the Elks for a time. My mother was a founding member of the Jack and Jill, which is an organization for Black mothers and children, and she founded the chapter here in New Haven along with several other women, and that was her main outlet. Uh, my father was kind of a homebody, so he was in the Elks for a while, and then he dropped out of that. And their social life was really centered around family, because as I mentioned in my presentation, my mother's sisters and brothers all moved here. The youngest sister Lillian actually went to New York, actually, but our a lot of our uh, contacts was within the family picnics, picnics at my aunt's house in West Haven, going to the beach together, uh, visiting my aunt and uncle in New York. So we were a tight knit family growing up.
And to follow that up, were there any indications in any of the research that you had, or any stories that you have, that they were victims of any discrimination or violence?
Well, I told the story of from my mother's childhood. Um, I mean, it's really difficult to pinpoint anything, but I think how can I say this? They were capable of so much more than they had the opportunity to do, right? My father remembered his high school French, and my father helped me with my algebra homework when I was in high school. Now remember, my father was 42 when I was born, so it was a long time from when he had algebra in high school. And I realized that he was probably on the college prep track, and when he was in high school, if he took those courses. But given the economics and the limited opportunities that the men in his family had for increasing their income, he was not able to go to college. and same thing on my mother's side. So it's not so much that there, that it's that racism is something that, it's you have moments of bigoted
Mhm.
interactions, but it's the general uh, economic and social uh, lack of opportunities that is really, really what is most damaging.
Another question is, and you may have touched on this a little bit, but as far as like putting the letters together and finding them, what was the process for that?
Okay, though that's a good question. So I found the letters after my mother died in 2007, and I didn't do anything with them for a couple of years. It just didn't dawn on me that uh, to do anything with them initially. But then I started to think that I had to take care of the letters because my parents had saved them for so long. And my initial thought was just to transcribe them. And that took about a year to transcribe them, and then decided to, uh, thought about doing a book. And uh, my friend Enola Air was the first person I approached and asked her what she thought about it. And she encouraged me to go forward and write a book. And I actually started by journaling because I wanted to put information about the family history in the book, but it was difficult to recall everything all at once. So I would remember things. I'd be in the kitchen and I remember something, or wake up in the middle of the night and remember something. So I had little notepads all over the house and in the car. So when I remembered something, I could put it down. And I ended up at the end of a year or so with about a 20-page document of memories of things my mother told me and passed down, things that I experienced. And those memories uh, are what are the basis for the opening section of the book on the family history, and then my reflections on my parents after the letters. So that was where I started writing down what I knew, and then using that as a basis to do research and figure out, uh, document what I thought I knew about my family, and to fill in some of the missing pieces. So at the point I finished that first sort of journal of what I recalled, I didn't know about Henry Jones, and I didn't know about my great grandfather being a chef. That's information I found through the research. Specifically, what I did, I the first thing I did after I did that journal was to go on ancestry.com, and I looked up, and my mother's my grandparents in Catawissa, Pennsylvania, which is a very small town. So Clarence Brooks, I knew his name, in Catawissa, Pennsylvania. That was pretty easy. He popped up. He popped up as a child, and so his mother was there with the father, and then there was this man named Henry Jones also with the family, which was identified as um, um, a father. And so that's the first I heard that name. Another link popped up saying, "Look, find other people looking for Henry Jones." And there was a person. I clicked on the link, and there was a person also looking for Henry Jones. I contacted that person through the ancestry system, and she responded, and we exchanged a little bit of information, and voila, we figured out we were cousins, and cousin I didn't know I had. And that, we kind of took off from there. We had a reunion. She was in connection with her branch of the family. We gathered in Catawissa, and I took photographs of all the headstones. There's 4 generations of my family buried in this cemetery, a Quaker cemetery in Catawissa. I took pictures of all the headstones, and then I wrote to the local historical society, asking them to send me everything they had. And they sent me a nice thick envelope with the obituary that I read, obituaries of others, and I was off and running from there.
And kind of like a follow-up kind of to this, um, putting it together and doing it for yourself is one thing, or for future generations to look back at your own family. What was it like for you to turn it into something that you would put out and publish as a book?
Ah,
And a follow-up to that one, the same person asked, will you be writing more books?
Okay, yes, I will be writing more books. The process of going from a manuscript to a book is really, really a lot of work. First of all, it's proofreading, proofreading, proofreading. My poor brother Roy was one of my proofreaders. I don't know how many times I tagged him to proofread. I had paid 2 people to proofread, and I still found little nits after that. So proofreading is a huge part, and that's one of the I self-published, and that's one of the criticisms of self-published books is they're not proofread well enough. So I really emphasize that. Um, and then and it's just then working with the publisher, laying out how I wanted the pages to look. For example, I wanted every letter to start on a new page. I wanted to have pictures at deliberately, deliberate places in the book. I had to do all the citations, which was a lot of work. And I had visited a lot of websites too, for the notes I mentioned earlier, where musicians and entertainers. I had, but when I visited those websites, I didn't document the date. I checked those websites, and I found later that that was supposed to be part of the citation. So I had to spend a lot of time just going back to all the websites, and you'll see in the book they're all accessed at the same date. I used the Chicago Manual of Style for the citations and for just technical uh, advice on how to whether or not I needed to footnote things. So there are some things the advice I got from, oh, I forgot to mention one other step. I hired a professional editor, and her advice was that I didn't need to do footnotes because it's a memoir. It's not really a history book. It's not really meant as an academic resource, but that I should put as many citations in the text of the many text of the book as possible. And then I do have some, I call it a list of sources at the end, where I list the books that I used, other pay-for websites that I used that I couldn't put links in the text itself, or couldn't just have a reference and not a formal citation. Because some websites tell you exactly how you have to lay out a citation. So that part, that was enormous. Getting it technically correct, so I wouldn't be sued, and the proofreading. Even after it was typeset, I think I made 250 corrections of the proof.
It's a lot. That's a lot to go through. I mean, it sounds like a great undertaking, especially when it's such personal work for you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pop on for a second. Say thank you very much for joining us today. We had a lot of the questions in the chat were congratulations. You've got some family members that remember and really enjoying hearing you tell the story. We didn't get to all the questions, but some of them were a little more detailed, and I think that we're going to be doing a workshop with you at the end of March.
Yes.
In about a month and a half now. And so I think if you'd like to come back and join us, I'm sure we can get into some of that, especially how that relates to writing down your own family's history. So we'll tease it, and we'll invite everybody to come back to do some more work with us. Jill, thank you so much for taking the time tonight. We really appreciate you being here and putting this on. And thank you all for the audience, and Margaret Ann and Julie and Kim have helped put all this stuff together here at the museum. So I'll give you the last word.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Margaret Ann. Julie did an amazing job. Khalil, thank you. Thank you to everyone who stuck through my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. It was my pleasure, absolutely. And I look forward to coming back in March to get everybody involved in telling their family story.
Yeah, we're very excited. I think it's going to be a really good workshop, and all the different facets, and it'll be more of a meeting. So we'll be able to do a little more face-to-face with people during that presentation. So thank you all for joining us.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.